So I asked some of the cover crop guys, I said, do I need to go in and rip and shatter that hard pan before I do my cover crop? They said, well, you don't need to do anything. Just go out there and plant your cover crop and it'll take care of that hard pan. And I thought, oh, come on, get out of here. No way will that work. Well, it did.
Dr. Bill Robertson recently retired after a long career as the Cotton Extension Agronomist with the University of Arkansas Extension Service. He also worked for the National Cotton Council for a few years, focusing on improving the sustainability of cotton production. Bill and his wife Carey have a livestock farm where they raise sheep and many other livestock species using prescribed grazing methods. In this episode of Voices from the Field, NCAT agriculture specialist Nina Prater talks with Bill about how he came to understand soil health as essential to a profitable farm, whether the farm is growing crops or livestock. Let's listen.
Welcome to today's episode of ATRA's Voices from the Field. I'm Nina Prater, NCAT agriculture specialist, and I'm joined by Bill Robertson, recently retired Cotton Extension Agronomist with the Arkansas Extension Service. Bill is also a farmer with his wife Carey, raising cattle, Katahdin sheep, goats, livestock guardian dogs, turkeys, chickens, ducks, pigs. Am I forgetting anything?
Just a little bit of everything.
Okay. So Bill, I think it's safe to say that you're retired, but not really retired. Is that right?
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm retired from the university, but working full-time here at the house. I was telling somebody the other day, I need to find me a consulting job because I need a rest.
That sounds about right. So I'm really excited to talk to you today about different soil health and conservation practices that you've seen farmers and researchers implement that have really helped folks improve their soils and their profitability. So we'll be focusing on cotton and other agronomic crops that you've worked with, but soil is soil, and these lessons can be applied much more broadly than just Arkansas cotton fields, I think.
Right.
So to start with, can you give us a little background about yourself? I think I read you grew up on a farm in Texas. Is that right?
Yeah, I grew up on a farm northeast of Lubbock, Texas. I grew up on a farm that was homesteaded on my mom's side of the family. Anyway, we stopped farming whenever I started college. But I grew up on a family farm. We raised mostly cotton, but we had grain sorghum. We had wheat, and most of the time wheat was to graze our cows on. And then if it looked like we were going to have a good crop, then we'd take it to grain. If we didn't, we'd go ahead and graze it out. But those were our main commodities. And then in school, I showed hogs, so we had some hogs, and so messed with the cattle and hogs as far as the livestock too.
So you really grew up with a background in all kinds of different production types.
Yeah.
But then, so was it after you got your PhD that you ended up moving to Arkansas?
Right. I did my undergrad at West Texas State, or it's actually West Texas A&M now, in Canyon, Texas, south of Amarillo. And I was out of school for about 5 years and did some different things. I ended up working for a plant breeder at a seed company, and in that world, I saw right away I needed to go back to grad school if I was ever going to move up. So I moved to College Station, Texas, or actually lived in Bryan, and started a master's in 1985, and then went on toward a PhD.
And I saw, so you had plenty of time working in Texas and, growing up on a farm in Texas. And then you moved to Arkansas. And in an article that I read about you from when you retired, it quoted you saying, "Soil health came on my radar because I saw Arkansas farmers spending a lot of money on the crop and doing things that did not make sense to me. I realized that soil health was a limiting factor, and fixing that would fix a lot of things." So what were farmers doing that didn't make sense to you?
Back up a little bit. It took me a long time to finally come to that conclusion.
Uh-huh.
Because, I grew up around Level, and our native potash levels are high in the soils due to the parent material that was in that region. When I moved to Arkansas, our potash levels are low, and right away was working with cotton farmers, and most of the work I did was in a farmer field and not on a research station. But some of the farmers I worked with would get a very low recommendation for potash or even a zero recommendation for potash, and they'd still put potash out. Like I work with some farmers that would put out potash in the fall or the spring, and then they would put on additional potash right before bloom. And it just didn't make sense because we were well and above what the soil test recommendations for potash were. And so I asked the farmer, I said, why are we doing this? And he said, well, that's just, what we have to do to have high yield potentials, to maintain our high yield potentials. He said, I'll tell you what, this farmer I was working with was in St. Francis County, and he had just gotten yield monitors on his picker. He said, I'll tell you what, let's pick me 3 strips in that field, and we'll not put potash out prior to bloom. And so I picked 3 strips, and then when we harvested and looked at the yield map, those 3 strips were red in color because they had a lower yield. And so there were a lot of things that were going on, especially with potash that just did not make sense. And then after several years working with farmers, that's just most everybody bumped the potash recommendation. And then I was cotton agronomist in Arkansas for 12 years, 12 growing seasons. And then I went to work with the National Cotton Council. And when we were there, the sustainability thing was taken off and so forth. And I worked with, I got to know some of the needs of the supply chain. The supply chain wanted to have cotton that they could document is being produced more sustainably.
Mm-hmm.
And so then when we looked at, some of the different tools to measure how sustainable we are, the Field to Market Alliance for Sustainable Agriculture had a tool called the Field Print Calculator. And so we started working with that. And one of my jobs with the council was to see if it worked in cotton. So one of my counterparts, actually one of my old bosses, run a pilot program in Louisiana, and then I run one in Texas, close to the area where I grew up, and to see if it worked in cotton. We made a lot of improvements in the program, but the bottom line was it worked good for cotton, and we could look at it and measure sustainability. The easiest things we could do to improve sustainability, or the quickest way, is to use cover crops and reduce tillage. And so at that point, we were improving soil health, we were improving rooting, but kind of when I got involved there is I kind of had a little bit of a shift on how I looked at things. A lot of times as an agronomist, and I think I was guilty of this as much as anybody, we kind of focus on, we do a soil test for nutrient analysis and nematodes and so forth. But other than that, we really don't give a lot of thought to what's going on with the root system on the plant. We focus on from the soil up. And when I got into the sustainability part and looking at how we could be better sustainably, I started thinking about what was going on in the root system. And that's where some of those things started making sense, that the producers, why were we getting a yield response by putting out extra potash? And part of that is because of our lack of soil structure. And because we had a deep root on the cotton plant to start off in the season, but then as we got through the season, we used moisture, and I looked at plants that were like 1.5 inches tall. They were putting on the second true leaf, and I could find roots down 6-8 inches deep. And then as we got closer to the time the plant started putting on the fruit, the plants are typically about 8 inches. I could find roots down 16-18 inches deep. And so, we were having a deep root system, but in a dry year, and this year's even been drier than that. But once we get into the point of the season that the plant starts putting on fruit and we haven't irrigated, we hadn't gotten a lot of rain, there's a hard pan that starts developing about 6 to 7 inches down in a lot of our soils. A lot of our soils tend to be fragipan in nature, a lot of silt loam soils. But we get that hard pan starting to develop that's hard to get a soil probe through. And then by the time we get to flowering, and that's when people really like to start irrigation initiation at flowering, there was a hard pan about 6 inches that you could not get a soil probe through.
Wow.
And, when you look at nutrient uptake on cotton, when it starts, the nutrient and water demands on the cotton plants is minimal until you get to the time it starts producing fruit. And then it starts increasing at an increasing rate. And it really kicks it in gear when you get to flowering. So when we get to flowering on a cotton plant, and that hard pan is 6 to 8 inches, and a single irrigation or a single rainfall event is not going to bust through that hard pan, then it was almost like we were handcuffing the cotton plant to where, if it couldn't get in that top 6 inches, it wasn't going to get it hardly. There were very few roots that were below that by the time we got to the end of that time of the season. So it kind of made sense. That's why we got an extra yield response to that potash, because we had to make sure that those elements were super available to the plant at the time it really needed it, because it had a very limited root system.
That's
And
really
so,
interesting.
I come to the conclusion that probably, I really feel like our most limiting factor in crop production, and cotton, I started with cotton, but I think it goes to all row crops, and then even looking at our pastures, is lack of soil structure, especially in our soils we have in the Mid-South are more weathered than they are in the soils where I grew up. I was very surprised when I first moved to Arkansas. I moved here and we got a big rain, and I was expecting to sink down in the soil in the row crop fields, 8 or 10 inches like I would at home. And here you could just walk on the side of the bed, you could straddle the water, and sometimes you wouldn't even leave a footprint. I just could not believe how different the soils were here in Arkansas in the Mid-South than they were on the southern high plains of Texas. And a lot of that goes to, infiltration rates, how weathered our soils are. We have a lot more silt here. Our silt levels on the soils in the southern high plains were a lot lower than they are here. But anyway, the ability of a plant to develop a root system and to be able to extract what it needs when it needs it is so different here. And that's why those extra potash things that farmers did help put money in their pocket.
Right,
And
right. Because the
yeah,
the the
and so
potash might have been there in the soil,
yeah, oh yeah,
but
when you do a
the plants
sample
just
and
couldn't
all that,
access it.
yeah, the potash was there.
Mm-hmm.
We just didn't have a root system on the plant to get it.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, consultants would call me and they say, Bill, I got potash deficiency showing up in my cotton and it's way too early. I've got some leaf defoliation going on and all that. And I would encourage them to go to the areas of the field where they were seeing potash deficiency the most and sample. And a lot of times I'd ask them to do a 0 to 6 inch sample, which is our normal sample on cotton. Then I'd ask them to go ahead and sample the 6 inch down to 12 inch sample. Do that in the area where they were seeing significant potash deficiency symptoms, and then go to a good area of the field. And a lot of times there was more potash in the area where they were seeing the deficiency symptoms than there were in the others. So the potash was there. We just did not have a root system on the plant. Sometimes it was a very shallow hard pan. Sometimes it was nematodes, but it was something going on that was limiting the root system on the plant.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, a lack of soil structure is one of the big things. We don't get good water infiltration. So, the roots grow where the water is.
Right.
And so if we don't get, our water infiltration is pretty shallow, then our active roots are very shallow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, you look in our pastures, we see the same thing with our pastures. Because in the soils where we have poor water infiltration, we have a lot of compaction after a big rain, it all runs off, or you see water standing in rows. A lot of times, you go out to the pasture, situation where I am now outside of a cotton field. After a big rain, you don't see puddles of water. And it takes a really big rain and a fast rain sometimes to put much water in our ponds because it all soaks in.
Right, right.
Some of our neighbors will get a big rain. They talk about, well, that flushed our ponds out pretty good. And,
Mm-hmm.
we might, we put some water in the pond, but we didn't get as much water in our pond as our neighbors did because we were able to harvest or to capture more of the rainfall than they did. So it makes
Yeah.
a difference in how your pastures look.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We've seen the same thing on our farm when we implemented rotational grazing back in 2010. We like in the couple years after that, we saw the same thing with our ponds, like, they're not filling up real fast after a rain.
Right.
Where's it going? Oh, going in
It's
the
all soaking
soil.
in.
Yeah, that's great. That's so interesting. So, you started making these observations and seeing what an impact the plow pan had on farmers' ability to grow cotton. What started you down the path? Like, what were some things you started learning about with soil health at that point?
Well, really, I guess what started me on soil health is, I was with the National Cotton Council. And so I was, before I was working just in Arkansas and, Mississippi, University of Mississippi State, I mean, had what they called a cotton short course. Now it's a row crop short course. But they had a meeting there that we would go to, as employees of the National Cotton Council. And there was a retired researcher, a USDA researcher in Alabama, Richard Petcher was there, and he talked about cover crops. And I'd visit with some people with cover crops, but his presentation, talked about the benefits in row crop and he talked about the benefits in pasture. And when I was working with the National Cotton Council, I wasn't doing any research in the field, but my wife and I had just bought this farm. And this farm that we bought, a lady that had it before us had a bunch of horses, and our farm was in pretty bad shape. When you're a soils class, a lot of times, and I think it's a lot of university professors are this way. When you start a soils class, they say, okay, what's the difference between dirt and soil? Dirt's what's on the bottom of your shoe when you come out of the field. Soil's what we have in the field because it's living. But I really think there were a lot of bare places in our pastures. So I think we had we had big patches of dirt in our pastures because I don't know that there was much life. Because there were when we bought this place, there was a couple of cows that came with it because nobody could catch them. And but the cow patties like sat there forever. They didn't
Uh-huh.
disappear. And so so there wasn't a lot of biological activity. When you look at it now, our cow patties, they disappear really quick.
Mhm.
And then, we've kind of thinned back on our cows and more on sheep and goats, and the manure distribution on sheep and goats is just out of the world. But anyway, I was working with the National Cotton Council, wasn't doing anything in a cotton field, so I wanted to try some of the cover crops. And so Richard said, well, he gave me a bunch of seed and he encouraged me to plant some things by themselves and then some things in a mix. And one of the things that I did was cereal rye and hairy vetch. You had a lot of others, but when I had the cereal rye, I had like like little plots. But when I had the cereal rye by itself, it grew and did well, and I had the hairy vetch by itself, similar things. But when I had the two mixed together, then the cereal rye and the hairy vetch seemed like it did better. And so, when I started working with that and seeing what what improving the diversity did to things on plant growth. And then that was an observation that was that just jumped out at me, that at how much having diversity out there helps. And then, when it got into this, then we got into looking at, why does it help? Like hairy vetch is a lagoon and it fixes nitrogen, but most of our clovers and other things really don't start fixing nitrogen until they bloom, until they start flowering. Well, how was hairy vetch helping cereal rye early in the season before it ever started blooming? And then I kind of got back in. I remember in college when I took plant physiology that, the professor talked about root exudates. And, that just seems so silly to me, the plants leaking out photosynthate, leaking out sugars and all of this. And the main thing I was worried about on that whole discussion was it going to be on the test? I just, but then, when you get to looking into things, the root exudates are a big part of what's going on with the plant's interaction with the soil microbes, and having the different species out there with different exudates, just having that diversity of plants and diversity of root exudates really jump starting the soil microbe community and all that. Because I hear people say all the time, and I'm this way, and I use this myself. I said, okay, Bubba, Bill, when you go to the salad bar, do you get just one thing, or do you get a whole bunch of different things? Well, I get a whole bunch of different things. So I like having that diversity. Well, the bugs and the microbes in the soil, or I say bugs in the soil, because a lot of times people that raise livestock or ruminants, we talk about the bugs in the gut. Well, the bugs in the gut on a ruminant do kind of some of the same things that the bugs in the soil, the microbes in the soil do. In the ruminants, mostly bacteria. And we got bacteria, we got fungi, we got protozoa. They all do different things in the soil, but they're kind of working. There's a lot of parallels there. But having that diversity out there really, really goes a long ways. And then I got to seeing how, we had kind of shifts in the species of plants that were growing in our pastures. And we're still experiencing that. We're getting plants that are more palatable to animals. And when you do your prescribed grazing, give things a rest period, it certainly helps, especially anybody that raises small ruminants knows how much of an issue is for the rest period for helping with internal parasites, because internal parasites are a big issue. My wife, I learned a lot about small ruminants from my wife, because I never had any sheep or goats when I was growing up, but I hear her talking all the time that most people that get into small ruminants are in and out in 5 years, because internal parasites just really wreck that situation if you don't manage for those. So, we give the plants a rest period. We're getting so much more grazing. Water was soaking in. And so started putting all this together, and it all goes to soil health. And I was thinking, wow, if this works good in pasture, it's got to work good in row crop too. And so that's kind of where the soil health and the cover crops and not tearing down soil structure when you get it built, that's where it finally come on my radar screen. Then when I finally, it was something that I noticed. Well, then there were a handful of farmers in Arkansas that had been doing that all the time. And I never really noticed it. So then I got to working with some of those farmers that were doing those things and learned so much from them. But when you first get into something like that and you learn, there's some things that people tell you, say, oh, that can't be right. I don't believe that. And so there were, I call that my BS flag, the flagpole, when there's things that they tell me. I said, oh, that, is that right? That can't be right. I got to test that out and see.
Yeah, no way. You can't.
Yeah, no way can that work.
That's not possible.
Really. One was, I started, I wanted to work with farmers to help them be more sustainable. the supply chain on some of the tools that we use, like the field print calculator, it measured basically their environmental footprint. So the smaller your environmental footprint was, the more sustainable you are.
Mhm.
And so that's what the supply chain wants. Well, what does a farmer want? What do you want in your life, in your production situation? You want to be more profitable. And so I looked at trying to align those things. Okay, what can I do in a cotton field to make the cotton be more sustainable, and yet the producer be more profitable? And so I started working with farmers, and going through it. A lot of times I'd get with a farmer, and we'd pick a 40-acre field, and we'd split a 40-acre field in half. And so on one side of the field, basically 20 acres or however it worked out, on one side would I'd ask the farmer to do what you've always been doing on this side. And on this other side, we're going to work with you to try to incorporate cover crops, but and to greatly reduce your tillage. But we're going to try to do it in a way that we don't have to spend a lot of extra money on planter modifications or anything like that. We want to try to have cover crops and use your same equipment that you've been using, just change your timings and change some of the things that you do. And so we learned a lot about that. And so when I first started getting into that, we'd go into a field at harvest time. You go out there with a shovel or a soil probe, and a lot of times you could not, it'd just be dry as all get out at harvest, but you just hardly could not get a soil probe to go past 6 inches. So there was a hard pan there that was just unbelievable.
Mhm.
And so I asked some of the cover crop guys. I said, okay, I'm going to split this field in half with different farmers across state. Do I need to go in and rip and shatter that hard pan before I do my cover crop, or what? Or how long is it going to take to address that? They said, well, you don't need to do anything. Just go out there and plant your cover crop, and it'll take care of that hard pan. And I thought, oh, come on, get out of here. No way will that work.
Mhm.
Well, it did, and
Wow.
and it was crazy. We started with cereal rye, and if you get on Twitter and other things and look, and they talk about cereal rise. Cereal rise is the cover crop with training wheels, is what a lot of people say.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of that is because it's very easy to establish. About the only time I ever really had a failure getting a stand of cereal rye doing broadcast surface applying is if the soil was really dry. If I have any kind of soil moisture, then generally don't have an issue getting a stand of cereal rye. But what happened was the soil was really, really dry, and I did a broadcast surface application of cereal rye in a cotton field, and we did that before we harvested. And we got like a quarter of an inch of rain, so it was just enough to get the cereal rye to germinate,
Mhm.
and then there wasn't enough soil moisture for it to continue to grow, so it basically come up and died.
Mhm.
But but so then my guideline is, if you have a little bit of soil moisture, put your cereal rye out, and then when you get a rain, it's going to germinate, it's going to emerge, and then there's enough moisture in the soil to for the cereal rye, for the plant to survive. And so when you do that, then I've not had an issue getting a stand of cereal rye.
Mhm.
And so, we started off, our goal was to plant a bushel an acre. And so, a bushel of cereal rye is 56 pounds. So a lot of times, I'd shoot for a bushel and I ended up about 50 pounds. Well, then, there was one year we had some problems and some things going on, and we only put 40 pounds of cereal rye out. And it looked really thin. But the thing is, and that I've noticed, and it was even evident this year, a lot of times our above ground growth of cereal of whatever cover crop is, I don't think is, it, this year it was a lot lower, our above ground growth. But I think the thing that I plant cover crops for, I plant cover crops for to have active roots in the soil. When I have active roots in the soil, especially of a diverse population, we have all these different things that are leaking from the roots with root exudates. And so we're feeding the soil microbes. So when I put a cover crop in, my goal is to feed the soil microbes. Now, a lot of times when I work with a farmer, I can get a farmer to say, okay, we're going to plant this cover crop so we can get surface residue to keep pigweed from coming up. And but then once we get into it, then when they see how much more effective a rainfall is or an irrigation is, then the impact it has on compaction and building soil structures, what keeps them in.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think we have to have as much surface residue as sometimes we might think, because sometimes we think, okay, we want a lot of residue out there so that we can have a big boundary to keep the soil microbes from coming up. But when you look at plants, the thicker you have plants, a lot of times the less root system you have.
Huh.
So when you plant them thinner, then we're like encouraging the plant to have a bigger, better root system. And
Interesting.
and you know, and I'll talk to people about this, cotton, and a lot of times I use like an okra plant, but you can use cotton and okra in the same plant family. But like an okra plant, it's got, when it first comes up, you got the main stem leaves, and then you have leaves on branches and all that. But anyway, the leaves on a young plant, their main job is to produce energy to grow above ground and below ground biomass. So we're growing a root and shoot. And so that's their main job. And then when the plant gets to a certain place, it starts kind of shifting its focus from vegetative growth to reproductive growth. But during that vegetative time, that plant is kind of like us. And when we look at our money situation, because I know there's a lot of times we run out of money before we run out of month, don't we? And so sometimes that plant does the same thing. It's got a budget. Okay, here's how much energy I'm going to put toward a root system. Here's how much energy I'm going to put toward above ground biomass. Okay, a root and shoot. But then if you got your plants really thick, well then the plant kind of gets in a situation where it's got to rob from Peter to pay Paul, because the main thing it's got to do, it's got to grow faster or taller than its neighbor to get the sunlight.
Uh-huh.
So if you have them really thick, well then they've got to outgrow their neighbor. So they end up stealing away some of the energy that they might use for the root system to grow a bigger top of the plant so they can outcompete their neighbor, whether the neighbor's a different plant or even a neighboring plant that's right next to them. So if you have a plant that's a little thinner, then it doesn't have to use so much of its resources to grow above ground. So it's got a little bit of money left in the bank, and you can encourage it to build a bigger, better root system. Well, having that bigger, better root system is what we want. So, I've heard golfers say, and I'm not a golfer by any means, but I've heard golfers like John Daly and some of them talk about, you drive for show, you putt for dough. Have you heard that?
No, I don't
Oh,
follow golf. Drive for show, putt for dough.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Being a good putter is where you're gonna make your money. If you're
Mm-hmm.
that's where you're gonna win the tournaments. To be able to finish it all, to be
Mm-hmm.
able to putt. Well, I kind of think that on our cover crop, the above ground is for show. The roots are for dough. The roots are going to be what helps make you money. And
Oh, that's
so
a great analogy.
this year on some of our cover crops, there were people talking about, well, I'm not getting as much above ground biomass. Well, the main thing that I want to look at, well, take your shovel out there and look at how many roots you have. You got some fields that's really good. You got some fields where it's not so good. Look at your roots. See if you see a difference in like the density of the roots, how deep the roots go. And a lot of times they say, well, I don't see any difference. They say, well, that's what's going to make you money right there, is
Mm-hmm.
having that good root system down there, because we're needing to get the biological activity of that soil. We need to keep it going and keep it primed and keep it running. And so we're doing that when we have that good root system on our cover crops down there.
Don't have time to stay up to date on the freshest sustainable agriculture news, events, and funding opportunities? You can trust NCAT to keep you connected with our weekly harvest e-newsletter. Subscribe today at NCAT.org and get your weekly harvest delivered each Wednesday.
Just to add to this, so you saw the power of cover crops, and then recently I bumped into you at the Arkansas Grazing Lands Coalition conference, and you were telling me about a trial that you did involving sheep grazing cover crops. Was that
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, we started working into a project looking at more regenerative production practices. Okay, there's 4 pillars to improve soil health, and one is to armor the soil, and one is to increase diversity. The other is having living soil in as many months out as possible, and then the fourth is to reduce tillage. So first 3, I feel like we're building soil structure, and then we reduce the amount of tillage, especially the more aggressive tillage. We're building soil structure, but we're not tearing it down. So then when you get into regenerative ag, then we have those 4 pillars, and then we introduce livestock into the situation. And I talked about having a diverse cover crop and some of those things. I really feel like when we get into regenerative ag, kind of the way, especially the way I look at it, and you think about one of the concepts that we're using is like crop intensification. And when you do that, we're looking at, okay, there's 2 different approaches. You can try to produce more crop by using more inputs, or you can try to maintain output by using less inputs. And so what we're wanting to try to do is maintain our current yields and using less inputs. And so when we build soil structure and improve soil structure, then we have greater water infiltration. Where we have greater water infiltration, you have deeper rooting. And where we have deeper rooting, we're more efficient with our water. We're more efficient with our nutrients. Because a lot of times where we used cover crops, we didn't see those potash deficiencies that I talked about earlier. On the other side of the field where we didn't do that, a lot of times we'd see potash deficiencies when we had really good yields. And so we're building, when we improve soil structure, we're building a better environment for the plants to grow roots. And then the second part of that, especially for cotton production, is you build that better environment for the plants to grow roots. Now you need to do things to encourage the plant to grow a bigger, better root system. Remember that when I talked about planting things a little thinner. So we cut our population on cotton down and all that. So we encourage that plant to produce a bigger, better root system. So when we put livestock in there, I think of, those 4 things that we do to improve soil health is like a 4-cylinder engine. And I think of, think of all the farmers out there that are doing 2 of those things or 3 of those things. And then we got some that are doing all 4 of those things. The 4-cylinder engine runs way better on 4 cylinders than it does on 3 cylinders if 1 cylinder is not firing. And so we just can't get very far down the road building soil health if we're just doing 2 of those 4 things, or even 3 of those 4 things. But if we're doing 4 of those, if we're doing all 4 of those things, then we can improve soil health. Well, how do we make that 4-cylinder engine a little better? We slap a turbocharger on there, and introducing livestock into the situation is, in my thought, how we put that turbocharger on that 4-cylinder engine to get more out of that 4-cylinder engine. And so then we're doing all these things to encourage a good root system and build a better root system. Then when we have livestock in there, that just like jump starts the amount of diversity that we have out there in helping to promote and feed the soil microbes that are out there. And so we had one study where the farmer didn't have any access to livestock, and so I used my gooseneck trailer, and I borrowed my brother-in-law's gooseneck trailer, and we hauled 95 ewes, and we had a little over an acre block that we grazed with sheep. And we ended up producing almost 60 pounds more cotton in that area. So that's something that we're looking at wanting to try to continue to do. But you look at the literature where they have done things similar to what we're doing, where they make improvements in cover crops and all these, and they pretty consistently see a yield improvement where they introduce livestock to a situation compared to where they didn't, doing everything else the same. And so we saw basically the same thing there. So I feel that's very encouraging. But not everybody has access to livestock or able to do that. And I think in some of the programs we're looking at, how can we use livestock manure and use as a compost, or with our chicken litter, just put chicken litter out in fields. But some of the things we can do along that line to help get some of the benefits that we have with livestock on the fields. That's kind of what we're looking at. And I think that's how we carry being sustainable to regenerative. I think that's what's going to keep us in business, because we can do things to reduce our environmental footprint to make us more sustainable on paper, but we may or may not necessarily have a big impact on our bottom line. But if we can carry that a step further and make the same yields with, or even better yields with less inputs, I think being able to grow a crop using less inputs is really what's going to keep us in business. But there's some hurdles out there that we have to overcome to do that. A lot of those, just like the farmers I talked about, well, they always bump the university recommendation on potash. Well, that's ingrained in people's heads, and that's a strategy it's going to be hard to break, because we've always spent extra money on some of those problems because that's what we needed to do. Some of y'all that may know me, I'm a pretty heavy guy, but when I go to the doctor and the doctor says, well, you have high blood pressure, so we're going to give you some medicine to treat high blood pressure. Okay. And so that brings the blood pressure down. Well, did I really have high blood pressure because that's, I'm inclined to have high blood pressure, or do I have high blood pressure because I'm fat? Well, I have high blood pressure because I'm fat. Okay, if I lose some weight, I probably won't have high blood pressure. So being fat is the problem, but we're treating the symptomology, the symptom of having high blood pressure,
So
we do that.
In that analogy, adding extra potassium is like the high blood pressure medicine, or the blood pressure.
Yes. Yeah. The real problem is we don't have a root system on the plant. How do we get a better root system on the plant? Improve soil structure. So we improve soil structure. Well, that potash deficiency goes away, so we don't have to spend the extra money on potash. We've been here in production ag. We've had the luxury of being able, I feel like, to throw money at a problem to fix the problem. A lot of times we're addressing the symptom and not fixing the problem, but we can address that. We can address that symptom by throwing extra money at the crop and still be able to come out on top. But we're getting into the point now to where we don't have extra money in the budget to throw at a problem. We've got to focus on fixing the real problems, what's causing that. And so I really feel like that's, another thing that's kind of giving this regenerative ag a little more footwork. A lot of the companies have made pledges to move that direction, and I think that's going to give more emphasis to producers to move toward that system, because a lot of times people don't change. Like me being fat, when do fat people start losing weight, or people that smoke? When do people stop? Try to stop smoking? Well, when their back's up against the wall, and either you're going to have to lose some weight, or you're fixing to die, or you're going to have to stop smoking, or you're fixing to die. And so when your back is up against the wall, then a lot of times we start looking at making those big changes and working around some of those hurdles that are out there. And so that's, and so I think in production agriculture, a lot of us, a lot of folks out there, their back is up against the wall, whether they want to admit it or not. And so we've got to, there's a lot of things that we're doing now that's not working right. Because it's hard to make money, especially when we look at 80-cent cotton. You're just barely paying your out-of-pocket expenses. we've got to do some things different to be able to consistently lower production expenses. So I think that's a direction we're going to see people going. And so it all kind of goes together with I think improving soil health is the foundation toward moving that way. I think everything builds around that. So you
Yeah.
can see I've drank the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, you're lowering that BS flag, and I'm like, it's not BS actually.
Yeah. There were a ton of BS flags that I looked at and say, well, I'm like, they were right. Well, why were they right? And so
Mhm.
as as a scientist, and those are some of the things that we look at. And the root exudates were a big part of that.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking again in college, is this going to be on the test? It seems so silly, but it's a big key to what's going on and why all this works.
Yeah. Well, oh my gosh, you've said so many interesting things that I want to. One thing that I think is really interesting is that the idea of doing more research, looking into how we can incorporate things like compost or manure, and is it possible? Answer the question: is it possible to have the same effect as grazing does on soil health with some of these, like poultry litter or whatever? Like if there's an input folks can use to, because I know incorporating livestock into crops is possible, but it has a lot of, like you were talking
Yeah.
about, a lot of barriers, fencing, water, finding the animals, trying not to
Yeah.
feed the animals,
Predators. Yeah.
predators.
It may not be as good, but I still think it's better than not doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, everybody's looking for an easy button, and we want the easy button. And I know even now, I'm home full time now, but there are a lot of things that I know how I want to do it, but we don't have any hired help. And I guess if we had a hired help too, it'd be something different, but we'd just have more acres and we still wouldn't be able to do it. But there are a lot of things I know what we need to be doing, but I don't always do them exactly that way. I just do them the best way I can.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are a lot of things that we can't do exactly how we want to do. We just do the best job we can do, and you got to move on. And so that's where the real life thing works in, because things don't always work and look like the picture in the book. Sometimes we got to go to plan B, plan C, plan D. A lot of times I'm on F, G, H, and sometimes Z and Y. But there's things have to be practical too.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so we just do the best we can do. And if we can't get the livestock there, if we can get the manure, and I know there's places where they're taking, I know in Southern High Plains where I grew up, there's a lot of feedlots up there. They're taking gin trash from the gin and mixing that 50-50 with the feedlot manure and composting that and using that as a compost. And I know some people that are using poultry litter and composting with different things, and even looking at going to their uh, some wooded areas and harvesting microbial communities that are there to build inoculum to help jumpstart
Yeah.
soil microbes that are native to your area,
Yeah.
and
I've
do
heard
that.
of that. That's super interesting.
Yeah. And so there are a lot of opportunities and a lot of things. So we just gotta
Mm-hmm.
look at those and kind of keep an open mind and just do the best we can. But I know I remember a preacher talked about one time in his service, on different things, and one guy said, well, he said, Pastor, I'm just doing the best I can. The pastor thought to himself, said, well, some people just have bigger cans than others. uh, but
Yeah, to expand, how do you expand that idea of what you can do? It's like,
yeah, I think there's, and we're starting to get more. The University of Arkansas hired um, a microbiologist to help them with in these areas. So there are a lot of things that as we get deeper and understand things more, that that I know the universities are putting resources into expanding research in different areas that we just haven't done a lot of work in before.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty exciting time really to be learning more and more about soil health. And like you were saying, we used to be able to just throw money at the problem, but
Yeah,
in recent years, it's like when fertilizer costs double,
yeah,
the money you throw doesn't go as far. And maybe we should look at more creative options of, closing the nutrient loop with compost and things like
yeah.
that. And
But some of those things, they talk about fashion, cycles again, after several years. Well, I think some of the cover cropping, some of the things you talked about, because before we had herbicides, before we had commercial fertilizers, we were doing a lot of these things. And some of the farmers I worked with talked about, well, my granddad or his dad, his great granddad, used to use hairy vetch and turn it under, green manure that. And
mhm,
so we used to do a lot of those things.
yeah.
And I know when I moved to Arkansas in 1995, there were, we had a lot of fertilizer facilities that made fertilizer. So basically, in Arkansas in 1995, when I first moved here, we made about the same amount of urea in the state as we used.
Hmm.
And so it all was all produced in Arkansas. And then natural gas prices got high, and the fertilizer companies can make way more money selling their 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 natural gas allotment than they ever could selling fertilizer. So they sold their allotment and shut the plant down.
Hmm.
And so then it got to where, that we don't make very much of our fertilizer here in the States anymore. We import it in because we could get it on a boat and unload it off a boat onto a barge and move it up the river in the barge and off a barge onto a truck and finally get it to our place. We could do that all cheaper than we can make it here. And then the cost of doing business with regulations and all changes and gets more expensive. And so a lot of our inputs that we use come from other countries because of a lot of different things. So, we've got to be able to make adjustments to be less dependent on other countries. But, some of these practices, some of the things that we used to do a long time ago, we're really finding a way to try to incorporate them back into what we do now. And so it's kind of interesting to think about.
Yeah, it really is. It's really not new. In one in one of my soil presentations that I've given, I have a slide about mulch and what, how important that is. Keeping the soil covered can be for, maintaining soil moisture. And I cite a research study from like 1950 that showed the benefits of mulch. And I'm like, this isn't new. None of this is new. It's much older than 1950. People have known this for millennia in some places. So it's like we're waking up from a dream or
Yeah.
a long dream where we could use synthetics and inputs. And now we're like, oh, wait, they're not perfect. We have to think about the soil too. So,
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of things come around. There was, I sent you this deal the other day with James Anderson in 1797, where he's talking about the benefits of having paddocks in a large pasture and doing rotational grazing, how you get more product or more meat off your land, and that and just doing the prescribed grazing, have different paddocks and rotating your livestock around. At 1797, he talked about that.
yeah.
And so a lot of people think, dividing your pastures up, because a lot of people have, you go to places, a lot of people have different pastures and they have gates, but the gates are never closed.
Right.
And so we got to close some gates, and
Mhm.
that's how we preserve our diversity out
Mhm.
there, is give the plants a rest. And having that diversity of the species that are out there in the pasture really helps, I think, build soil health. It speeds that process.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you have any parting thoughts for our listeners or do you want to point folks to resources that could get them on their move them further along on their soil health journey? Any final wisdom that to tie all this back together?
Well, I think one of the big things, especially if you're getting in to doing some of the things to improve soil health, is to find a mentor. And I know I visit with people that are really early adopters here in Arkansas, and a lot of them went to YouTube, and there were farmers from other parts of the country that they looked to and talked to and visited with. And some of those things work here, some of those things don't. But I think we have enough people here that are doing some of these things that are maybe just a few steps down the road further from where we are right now, where we want to be. Look for those type of people, and you can visit with them and kind of get a better idea of what works in Arkansas, and some of the things that you can try to get a little bit better. But having somebody more local that you can visit with and run things by really goes a long ways. And when I worked in extension, that was one thing that I tried to do when I worked with farmers, because just because a Dr. Bill Robertson gets up there and tells you need to do cover crops and all this, you'll think, well, okay, whatever. That may work on his still or his small plots and all that. But when I get the farmers that I worked with, when they get a farmer talking to another farmer, I think that carries a lot more weight and can influence a producer a lot quicker than a scientist can. So find those farmers out there that are down the road from where you are, but in a place that you want to head in the direction that you want to head yourself, and visit with them. Don't completely discount the university people and the extension and the others, because there's a lot of good information out there. But I think having a farmer, one of your peers that you can lean on for help, goes a long ways.
Yeah, that's great. It's so true, and it's so beneficial to have someone in your region to
Yeah.
to learn from too, because they understand the nuances of the rain patterns and the soil types, and
Yeah.
what resources are available nearby and things like that. So yeah, well, thank you so much. I wish I could keep talking to you all day, but
Yeah.
they don't let us do that. So for our listeners, we're gonna put a lot of ATRA resources and some University of Arkansas Extension resources in the show notes. So if you're curious about learning more, you can check that out. And Bill, did you want to share your email address if folks have questions? I know you do some consulting.
Yeah, my emails, I don't have my university email account anymore, but AR Cottonman, COTTONMAN, it's all one word, arcottonman@gmail.com.
Mm-hmm. And folks can contact me at Nina P, NINAP @NCAT.org if you have questions for me. Thank you so much, Bill. This has been a really great conversation, and hopefully we'll be able to get Carey on board for doing another episode about your farm, because I know
Okay.
people will probably want to hear about that too. So
Yeah. Well, I enjoyed our conversation this afternoon.
thank you so much.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at atra.ncat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Rich Myers. ATRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATRA Sustainable Agriculture Program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.